Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for the Traitors US Season 2 following Week 4, aka Episode 6. And this was definitely an interesting episode to say the least. Can't say I'm too happy with the outcome, but we'll get to that more in a moment. But there are 13 players to talk about, and let's waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 13, we have the only boot from this week's episode, and here we have Dan Giesling. And obviously it's a shame to see Dan going out here, especially right after Janelle, considering he was one of the biggest names on this cast. And at the same time, there was almost no suspense to this episode, considering that you could very clearly tell from early on that Dan was going home, considering that this was his plan of trying to murder Bergie, only for that to backfire. You could also tell based on the edit, where Dan was very much talking up this gamble, only for it to backfire, and that he was playing too slow and not aggressive enough, and that it's time to take control after finding out that Bergie had survived. And again, it was just very unlikely that Dan was going to get out of this. And then we later see during the roundtable, he does have this final Hail Mary of trying to throw Fedra on the bus, which, not to lie, was my favorite part of the episode. It was very fun seeing him outline this argument for why Fedra is a traitor, but at the same time, it was never going to work. It was pretty clear that the tables had turned on Dan, and obviously he was taken out here. And again, it is largely his own fault that he was taken out here, not only early on where he was too quiet, that obviously caused us to get onto him, but obviously with this move of trying to take out Bergie, falling right into Peter's trap, and then eventually being taken out as a result. So in a lot of ways, it's a shame to see Dan going out here, but obviously he is now out of the game, so he is here number 13. And with that, there are 12 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But at number 12, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is still Kevin. And again, I feel like Kevin doesn't really have much to do here. Again, he pretty much is only there at the round table and casts his vote for Dan, but even beyond that, you have him being part of this alliance that Parvati is now antagonizing, and I could very well see Kevin being an early victim to this, either being a murder victim or him being the most likely to be seen as a traitor. So again, I feel like Kevin's negative content throughout the season and now his affiliation with this more villainous alliance is going to come back to bite him by the end of it. So he's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have a person pretty similar to Kevin, except this person's edit is a bit more positive, and here we have John Burkow. And again, John didn't have much to do here either, where his only highlight in the episode comes during the roundtable, where he gives his really over-the-top speech while casting his vote for Dan, like talking about how traitors will be exposed and that Dan's a rat. I just found that all to be really funny and over the top. But again, I feel like John is another person that is extremely unlikely to win based off their edit, which is why they're here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, we have someone who is also pretty unlikely to win from this point, and here we have Kate. And obviously this is the first full episode to have Kate on the season, and in a lot of ways, she feels less like an actual player and more like a audience insert, where it feels like all of her content is her talking about how she has no clue what's going on and that she's just here for the ride. And again, I feel like a lot of that is pretty bad in terms of her actual chances here. Again, I feel like she probably has some longevity because what threat is Kate? But at the same time, I feel like with the amount of unawareness that she has and the fact that it takes up the bulk of her content is enough to have her here number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and I actually had this person a couple spots higher in last week's video, but they have since dropped, and here we have MJ. And I feel like MJ is definitely up there as one of the more under-edited characters across the season, where really she gets almost nothing to do in this episode, which is kind of a shame. And I feel like it's particularly bad in this episode, considering that MJ was one of the people that was on the Dan, and obviously with this being Dan's boot episode, you would think that she would have had more to do. But with her failing to get any confessionals and with her not getting to say that she avenged Larsa and avenged Marcus, I feel like that kind of knocks MJ down even further in my eyes. Now, yes, she could make it further in the game due to her not being part of this alliance, though at the same time, I could also see her being a suspect in the future, considering that we already had some sus on her from a couple episodes ago. So again, it is kind of a rough patch for MJ moving forward, so I have her here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we probably have one of the bigger characters from this latest episode, and here we have Peter. And I feel like this is probably the start of Peter's downfall, as I alluded to in previous videos, where while he is successful in getting out Dan after Dan falls into his trap, we also see the start of his rivalry with Parvati, where obviously Parvati is onto his alliance and seeing like his alliance as being like this group that will dominate the game and at the same time screw over the other faithfuls. and that eventually culminates in Parvati recruiting Peter to be a traitor. And I feel like this will probably go one of two ways for Peter, both of which are pretty negative. One is that Parvati will use this to immediately target Peter for being a traitor and throw him under the bus, sort of alluding to her earlier accusations based off his alliance. Or the alternative is that she works with Peter and strong arms him into taking out his own alliance members one by one. And I feel like with this alliance being presented as a negative for Peter's game and with his edit, I feel like it'll probably eventually culminate in Peter being taken out as a result. So I feel like the seeds are there for Peter to have a downfall, and I feel like now with Parvati onto him and sort of taking Dan's place, I feel like it's only a matter of time before Peter is eventually taken out here. So for that reason, I do have him here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and this person has actually dropped since my last video, but we do have Sheree. Now I've gotten some comments in my videos saying that I had Sheree too high, and to be fair, I feel like I am more of a defender of her compared to other people. But at the same time, I feel like this episode didn't really give me what I was looking for with Sheree, where obviously her only content in the episode comes at the beginning, where she talks about how Bergie's safe and that she's unsure what's going on, which obviously is okay, but beyond that, not really much to say here. Again, I feel like other people are kind of impressing me a bit more in their edit as of late, which is why I do have Sheree a bit lower here, though at the same time, I do have some faith in her to rebound. But for now, I do have her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this person has gone up a little bit since the last time I talked about them. And here we have CT. And again, I feel like this episode wasn't that bad for CT, where while he was on Peter's short list for being a traitor, obviously we see CT being taken off that list to where Peter really did have his eyes more set on Parvati and Dan. I feel like CT was able to avoid that. He also got a decent confessional in this episode, talking about how people are fed up with the faithless going home and that it's about time that a traitor went home. This was at the beginning of the episode during the breakfast, so I feel like that was good foreshadowing and a big reason why I felt like Dan had no shot here. So again, I feel like CT is kind of creeping up on me to a degree, but not to the same degree as the other people, so I have him here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we probably have the person I am the most conflicted on after this week, and here we have Parvati. And obviously the big thing to point out here is Parvati managed to outlast Dan, which is all pretty impressive. And now she seems to have this rivalry with Peter, which based on the edit, she seems to be on the good side of. And I could very well see her being the one to take down Peter. So I feel like all that is pretty good. I feel like Parvati is definitely in a better spot now that Dan is out of the game compared to before. But at the same time, I do still have my concerns about her, where I feel like people are still going to suspect her, or even though Dan went out this week, people are still suspecting Parvati of being a traitor, and that's obviously going to be a massive target on her back moving forward. You still have Sandra there, who keeps talking about how Parvati is good at deception and that they're already on to her. Again, I feel like the realistic signs of Parvati getting towards the end of the game are not that great. I feel like she will still have a lot of sus on her moving forward. And obviously, by the end of it, I feel like Parvati will probably lose the war. But again, I feel like this was still a relatively decent episode for her, where rather than murder Peter outright, she is deciding to recruit Peter and trying to get him out that way. And even beyond that, you have Dan not even throwing her under the bus, where he turned his eyes more towards Fedra, which I feel like is worth pointing out. So again, there were some good things that happened with Parvati in this episode, but I feel like the long-term prospects are still a bit concerning for me, which is why she's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have someone who I just mentioned, and here we have Sandra. And I feel like out of the big names on this cast, I feel like Sandra hasn't been getting as big of an edit compared to them, which to be fair is probably a good thing, as she's getting a relatively consistent presence that you would expect more from someone who actually is an endgamer compared to someone who gets way too much content early on. So I feel like the fact that Sandra isn't being as exposed as she probably could be is probably a positive for her long-term prospects. Now, in terms of her content this episode, she does say that she thinks that John got murdered because he's a faithful, which again, she is wrong, but whatever. And then later on, she gets another confessional setting up her rivalry with Parvati, talking about how she's good deceiving and that they're onto her. Again, it is content you would expect from Sandra. And again, I still feel like there's a good chance that Sandra does win this battle against Parvati, especially since that Parvati is now focused on Peter more so than on Sandra. So again, I feel like those are positive signs for Sandra, and a big reason why she is higher this week. Though I feel like the top three have been more consistently solid in their edits throughout the season, which is why she's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and it is the same top 3 as last week. However, I did change the order this time. By number 3, we actually have Bergie, who I did have a number 1 last week. And as I said, it was pretty clear that Bergie was surviving this based off how the last episode ended, but also based off the trailer that we got for the following episode last week. So again, it didn't shock me that Bergie was going to be the victim here, only for him to survive to the shield. And he does get his share at the beginning, talking about how, like, the Traitors trying to murder him, but he was saved by the shield. But at the same time, I feel like the stuff that we got later on in the episode wasn't that great for Bergie, if I'm being honest. For one, he is very solidly a member of Peter's alliance, where obviously he was very much part of this plan to trick Dan into murdering him. So obviously that's not great. And then even during the roundtable, we also saw him defending Fedra. And while he does support taking out Dan and that he gets a confessional afterwards talking about how it felt good to get a traitor, I don't love that he was defending Fedra here, who was another traitor, and him just being convinced that she's a faithful. So again, I feel like that was a pretty big knock to his edit, and a big reason why I did drop him from last week. But still, I feel like he's been getting one of the more consistent presences during the season, and I feel like he doesn't have as many holes in his edit compared to a lot of other people, which is why he is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I would have had this person at number 1 if it wasn't for something we got at the end of this last episode, and here we have Fedra. And obviously Fedra is another pretty notable character during the season, and we did see Dan trying to throw her under the bus at this roundtable, which does make sense from Dan's end, as obviously Fedra is less suspected of being a traitor rather than Parvati. So by being able to convince everyone that Fedra is a traitor, taking her out in a spot where they thought that Fedra was a faithful, probably would have done Dan more than if he were able to get a Parvati, not to mention that keeping Parvati is also keeping around a shield for him in the future. So again, I understand why Dan tried to take the shot here at Fedra, as he was playing more so to win than to potentially get through another round by taking out Parvati. But at the same time, we also see Fedra really defending herself during this roundtable, really cutting to Dan's argument, and very clearly having the rest of the cast on her side, to where it was very unlikely she was going to go home here, and obviously we do see her staying. So again, it is pretty impressive the work that she has done in terms of building bonds with people, and in general, having the least amount of sus compared to the other traitors. However, there are 2 reasons that I don't have her at number 1. One is we do see her at the end of the episode being unsure over whether to recruit Peter, which obviously ends up going through, so she doesn't quite get her way there. And I feel like that kind of ties into one of Vader's overall problems, is that she doesn't really get her way as much as the other traitors, and even at the points where she did get control, namely the Tamara murder, that was more so Dan giving her an olive branch after Dan had thrown her under the bus. So I feel like that's something to point out. But I feel like the bigger thing is we do get that confessional from Trishelle saying that Trishelle is onto Fedra, the only person in the cast to do so, and really in a spot that didn't feel necessary in the edit. So I feel like the fact that Trishelle is onto her could point to Fedra having a clear obstacle down the road. So I feel like that was enough to knock Fedra down to number 2. However, at the end of the day, I still feel like she's the most likely of the traitors to eventually win. So I have her here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win the Traitors Season 2 right now is Trishelle, someone who I just mentioned. And this could be a bit rash. However, at the same time, I did have her at number 3 last week, so take that for what you will. However, I feel like this was still a pretty solid episode for Trishelle, where even though she is part of Peter's alliance, however, I feel like she's gotten more complexity than a lot of those other people, and not really as much negative content, and I feel like she's gotten a lot of unnecessary content as well, where obviously she had that moment a couple of episodes ago, where she made up with CT after the roundtable, and the fact that neither her nor CT were murdered after that, I feel like that's probably a positive sign for Trishelle's edit in that regard. But then you have, in this latest episode, her like getting her way and taking out Dan, but then she, out of nowhere, gets this confessional after this last roundtable, where she says that she's the only one to suspect Fedra of being a traitor, which again felt largely unnecessary. And considering that it's unlikely we'll get a murder here, assuming that Peter takes up the offer of being a traitor, I feel like it's not going to have any immediate consequences for Trishelle's prospects in the game. And while it's possible she could be in for a rough time considering that her alliance is being targeted by Parvati, again, Parvati is someone who has sus on her, so it's not even as if it's a surefire thing that Parvati is going to successfully dismantle the alliance altogether, especially if she gets up Peter relatively early on. So again, there are some questionable things to point out with Trishelle's edit in her game, but I feel like that fact that she is the only person that we have seen to suspect Phaedra of being a traitor is enough to really prop her up in high contention for me. And I feel like with the flaws that I pointing out with the other people in my top 3, that kind of leaves Trishelle here at number 1. Though obviously this list could be in flux in the weeks to come based on how the rest of the game plays out. But I feel like for now, number 1 is a good spot to put her. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. And I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you look forward to that. I am covering Australian Survivor Titans versus Rebels, so you can expect weekly power rankings of that show, along with other content as we get through the Survivor offseason. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.